Rookie Officer Ethan Brooks had dreamed about this moment since the day he pinned on his badge. He believed the uniform meant responsibility, respect, and the chance to prove himself. But on a quiet stretch of Interstate 95 just outside Richmond, Virginia, one decision would become a lesson no academy could ever teach. The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the polished black sedan as it eased onto the shoulder beneath a sky painted in fading shades of orange. Traffic rushed past at 70 miles per hour, each passing vehicle carrying strangers who had no idea they were about to witness the beginning of a story that would soon dominate national headlines. Ethan stepped out of his cruiser with the confidence of someone eager to show he belonged. It was only his third week patrolling alone, and every traffic stop felt like an opportunity to prove himself to supervisors who constantly reminded rookies that hesitation could become a liability. His dashboard camera recorded every movement without emotion, capturing details no memory could ever change. Inside the sedan, Judge Naomi Carter rested both hands calmly on the steering wheel exactly as she had done during hundreds of traffic stops over decades of driving. At 52 years old, she understood procedures better than most officers ever would. As a United States federal judge, she had spent years reminding juries that justice depended on facts rather than assumptions. Today she was simply trying to drive home after a long afternoon inside a federal courthouse where she had presided over another exhausting hearing. Her briefcase sat neatly on the passenger seat beside a stack of legal files, and soft jazz drifted quietly through the speakers. She watched the rookie approach in her side mirror and took a slow breath, expecting nothing more than a routine conversation lasting a few minutes. Ethan stopped beside the driver's window and studied the woman behind the wheel. Something about the expensive sedan, the tailored navy blazer, and the unfamiliar license plate triggered questions in his mind before he spoke a single word. Training had taught him to observe everything, but experience had not yet. Taught him the difference between observation and assumption. He introduced himself in a steady voice before asking for her driver's license and registration. Naomi responded politely, informing him that the documents were inside her handbag and asking if she could reach for them. Ethan hesitated longer than necessary. The silence stretched across several uncomfortable seconds as the evening breeze carried the distant sound of tractor-trailers rolling down the interstate. A family driving past slowed briefly, curious about the flashing lights before continuing toward the horizon. Naomi noticed the young officer studying her face instead of her paperwork. His expression revealed uncertainty mixed with determination, as though he had already convinced himself that something about the situation did not fit. She remained composed, choosing patience over frustration. Years inside courtrooms had taught her that calm often revealed more truth than anger ever could. Neither of them realized that every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word was being preserved forever by the silent dashboard camera mounted inside the patrol vehicle, waiting for the day millions of Americans would watch the same few minutes and ask themselves one unforgettable question: how could an ordinary traffic stop become the beginning of a lawsuit worth $2.8 million? Naomi moved slowly, keeping one hand visible on the steering wheel while carefully reaching for her handbag with the other exactly as she had explained. She handed over her driver's license, vehicle registration, and federal judiciary identification without the slightest sign of irritation. Ethan accepted the documents, but instead of giving them the quick review expected during a routine traffic stop, he examined each one repeatedly. His eye shifted from the photograph to the woman in the driver's seat and back again as if he expected the information to contradict itself. The evening sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the shoulder of the highway while the steady stream of passing vehicles continued without interruption. Inside the sedan, the quiet jazz station kept playing softly until Naomi lowered the volume, wanting every word between them to remain perfectly clear. She had spent decades inside courtrooms where misunderstandings often began with simple assumptions. Experience had taught her that the calmest voice in the room frequently carried the greatest weight. Ethan cleared his throat and asked several additional questions that seemed only loosely connected to the original traffic stop. Where was she coming from? Why had she been driving through that section of the interstate? Was the vehicle registered in her own name? Naomi answered each question politely and directly, never raising her voice or challenging his authority to ask. She simply expected the conversation to follow established procedure. Instead, Ethan looked once more at her judicial identification before saying that he needed to verify everything through dispatch. He returned to his patrol vehicle with a determined expression, convinced that something still did not add up. The dashboard camera continued recording as he radioed in the driver's information. The dispatcher acknowledged the request and began searching multiple databases while Ethan watched Naomi through the windshield. She remained seated exactly where he had left her, both hands resting calmly in plain sight. There was no attempt to leave, no sign of panic, and no movement suggesting anything unusual. Even so, Ethan felt an uneasy certainty that he was missing something important. Several moments later, the dispatcher responded that the driver's license appeared valid and the registration matched the vehicle. Ethan frowned instead of relaxing. He requested another verification, this time asking for confirmation of the federal identification as well. The dispatcher paused for several seconds before replying that additional records were loading from another system. Those few seconds felt unusually long. A pickup truck passed by with children looking curiously through the windows at the flashing patrol lights before disappearing into the distance. Naomi watched the young officer from her side mirror and quietly reflected on how quickly uncertainty could influence judgment. She had seen similar moments unfold in court, when facts were delayed and assumptions rushed to fill the empty space. The difference was that inside a courtroom there were safeguards designed to slow those assumptions down. Out here, beside a busy American highway, everything depended upon the choices of one inexperienced officer. As another response crackled through the police radio, Ethan leaned closer to hear every word, unaware that the recording equipment inside his cruiser was preserving not only the conversation but also every hesitation, every expression, and every decision that would soon be examined frame by investigators, attorneys, reporters, and eventually an entire nation. The dispatcher spoke again, this time with noticeably greater caution. The federal identification number was valid, the name matched multiple government records, and the credentials appeared authentic. Ethan listened without responding immediately. Instead of accepting the confirmation, he stared through the windshield at Naomi, who remained exactly where she had been since the stop began, her posture composed, her hands visible, and her attention fixed on the officer rather than the growing line of vehicles slowing to pass the flashing lights. Something inside Ethan refused to let the encounter become routine. He remembered instructors warning recruits that forged credentials existed and that confidence could be used to deceive officers. Wanting to prove that he could not be fooled, he requested yet another verification. The dispatcher hesitated before answering that additional confirmation would require contacting a federal liaison because the judiciary database was not part of the department's standard patrol access. Ethan thanked the dispatcher and stepped back out of his cruiser. The warm evening air had cooled noticeably, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby field beyond the interstate. As he approached the sedan again, Naomi lowered her window the rest of the way before he even reached the door. She greeted him with the same calm expression she had maintained from the beginning. Ethan explained that he needed more time because he could not independently verify her federal credentials. Naomi nodded respectfully and replied that she understood the importance of careful verification. Then, in an even voice, she added that every officer also carried the responsibility to balance caution with fairness. Her words were neither confrontational nor emotional. They sounded more like the thoughtful observation of someone who had spent a lifetime watching difficult decisions unfold. Ethan acknowledged her statement but remained unconvinced. He asked whether she would voluntarily step out of the vehicle while he completed the verification process. Naomi paused for only a moment before politely asking whether there was a specific legal reason requiring that request. The question was simple, professional, and entirely respectful, yet it caught Ethan off guard. He searched for an immediate answer, finding himself unexpectedly aware that every sentence he spoke was being preserved by the dashboard camera inside his cruiser. Several motorists passing the scene briefly glanced toward the shoulder, sensing that the stop had lasted much longer than usual. One delivery driver slowed slightly before continuing south, while an elderly couple exchanged concerned looks from their pickup truck without stopping. None of them knew who sat inside the black sedan. None of them recognized the significance of the conversation quietly unfolding only a few feet away. Naomi remained patient, never interrupting, never raising her voice, and never attempting to end the discussion herself. Years on the federal bench had taught her that composure often revealed more about a situation than arguments ever could. At that very moment, hundreds of miles away, a federal courthouse employee noticed that Judge Naomi Carter had not yet arrived home as expected after leaving chambers. The observation meant nothing yet. It was simply an unanswered question waiting quietly in the background. Meanwhile, beside the interstate, Ethan reached for his radio once again, believing that one more call would finally settle his doubts. He had no idea that each additional minute was steadily transforming an ordinary traffic stop into a case that attorneys, investigators, and eventually jurors would examine with extraordinary care, guided not by assumptions or opinions, but by the silent precision of a camera that never blinked. The reply from dispatch did not bring the certainty Ethan expected. Instead, it introduced another layer of uncertainty that only strengthened his determination to continue. The federal liaison had not yet responded, and until that confirmation arrived, Ethan convinced himself that caution demanded additional steps. He walked back toward the sedan with measured confidence, stopping beside the driver's window once again. Naomi looked up calmly, her expression unchanged despite the passing time. She had spent years watching people make difficult decisions under pressure, and she recognized the subtle difference between careful judgment and growing suspicion. Ethan explained that because the verification process remained incomplete, he was instructing her to step out of the vehicle while he continued his investigation. Naomi listened carefully before responding in the same composed voice that had never wavered since the encounter began. She asked whether she was being detained or whether she was free to leave once the traffic matter had been addressed. The question was straightforward, respectful, and rooted in the language of the law itself. Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before answering that she was being detained until he completed his investigation. Naomi slowly nodded. Without raising her voice or making any sudden movement, she unfastened her seat belt, opened the driver's door, and stepped onto the shoulder of the interstate exactly as instructed. The evening had turned noticeably cooler, and the fading sunlight reflected across the rows of passing vehicles. She stood with quiet dignity beside her sedan while Ethan requested that she remain near the front of the patrol vehicle. Every instruction, every response, and every pause continued to be preserved by the dashboard camera mounted inside the cruiser. Imagine standing there after a long day of public service, answering every question respectfully, following every instruction carefully, yet realizing that the conversation kept moving farther away from the original reason for the stop. Naomi understood that frustration would solve nothing. Patience had guided her through countless complicated hearings, and she relied upon that same discipline now. Ethan, meanwhile, believed he was demonstrating thoroughness. He repeated several questions he had already asked, searching for inconsistencies that never appeared. Naomi's answers remained identical each time because the facts never changed. She explained again that she had left the federal courthouse less than an hour earlier after concluding scheduled judicial business. She explained again that the vehicle belonged to her. She explained again that her identification was genuine. Nothing about her account shifted, yet Ethan continued searching for a reason to doubt it. Back inside dispatch, another communication specialist quietly reviewed the incoming verification requests. The repeated inquiries began attracting attention because they involved a member of the federal judiciary whose credentials had already matched multiple databases. A supervising dispatcher glanced at the screen, frowned slightly, and instructed the operator to contact the on-duty patrol sergeant before the situation became unnecessarily prolonged. Those conversations remained invisible to both Ethan and Naomi. On the roadside, time continued moving slowly. A local news photographer driving home noticed the flashing lights and instinctively captured a few distant photographs before continuing down the interstate, thinking it was simply another routine traffic stop. He had no idea those images would later become part of a much larger story. Ethan looked once more at Naomi, still standing quietly with complete composure, and reached for his radio again. He believed one final confirmation would justify every decision he had made. Instead, the next voice that answered would begin changing the direction of the entire evening in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The radio came alive before Ethan could press the transmit button again. His patrol sergeant's voice was calm but noticeably firmer than before. He asked Ethan to remain exactly where he was and not to take any additional action until he arrived. Ethan acknowledged the instruction, although the request left him confused. He had expected another routine confirmation, not a supervisor responding in person. Standing a few feet away, Naomi quietly observed the brief exchange without asking a single question. She had spent enough years inside federal courtrooms to recognize that subtle changes in tone often revealed far more than dramatic words ever could. The minutes passed slowly beneath the fading evening sky. Headlights stretched into long ribbons of white and red across the interstate while the first streetlights flickered to life in the distance. Ethan reviewed the identification cards once more, studying every line as though a hidden answer might suddenly appear. Nothing looked fraudulent. Nothing appeared altered. Yet admitting that possibility now felt strangely more difficult than continuing to doubt it. He reminded himself that thorough officers asked questions others ignored. Naomi remained composed beside her vehicle, folding her hands comfortably in front of her as passing traffic created a constant rhythm in the background. She never complained about the delay. She never argued about the inconvenience. Instead, she quietly watched the young officer wrestling with his own uncertainty. After years of hearing testimony from witnesses, attorneys, and investigators, she understood that confidence without experience often led people to mistake suspicion for evidence. Several miles away, Sergeant Daniel Mercer was already driving toward the location after receiving an unusual briefing from communications. During the drive, dispatch informed him that the driver's federal credentials had now been verified through the judiciary liaison. They also advised that the prolonged roadside detention had attracted attention inside both the State Communications Center and the Federal Administrative Office responsible for judicial security. Mercer tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had supervised enough young officers to know that mistakes rarely began with bad intentions. More often, they began when someone stopped re-evaluating an assumption after new facts appeared. Back on the shoulder of the highway, another message quietly appeared inside the dispatch system. A federal judicial security officer had requested confirmation that Judge Naomi Carter was safe after receiving notice that her travel had been unexpectedly delayed. The dispatcher looked at the clock, compared the timestamps, and immediately relayed the information to Sergeant Mercer. Ethan remained unaware of that exchange. He believed he was still waiting for one final piece of verification, not realizing the verification had already been completed. The only thing still unresolved was how the situation would now be handled. Naomi glanced toward the horizon where the last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the trees. She thought briefly about the unfinished dinner waiting at home and the family members who would soon begin wondering why she was late. Even then, she chose patience. She believed that every public servant deserved the opportunity to correct an honest mistake before it became something larger. In the distance, another set of flashing emergency lights appeared, moving steadily through traffic toward the scene. Ethan instinctively straightened his posture, expecting routine support. He did not yet know that the next conversation would not focus on the reason he had stopped the vehicle. Instead, it would focus on every decision he had made after the facts had already begun pointing in a different direction, and the silent dashboard camera had preserved each one with perfect clarity. Sergeant Daniel Mercer brought his patrol sport utility vehicle to a smooth stop behind Ethan's cruiser, the flashing lights painting the quiet highway in alternating shades of blue and red. He stepped out with the calm confidence that came from more than 20 years in uniform and immediately noticed something that Ethan had not. The woman standing patiently beside the sedan showed no signs of fear, anger, or impatience. She simply waited with the quiet composure of someone who understood that truth did not become stronger by being spoken louder. Mercer greeted Ethan first and asked for a concise explanation of everything that had happened since the initial stop. Ethan described his observations, his repeated requests for verification, and his belief that additional caution had been necessary because the federal identification seemed unusual. Mercer listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the sergeant asked one simple question. Had dispatch informed him that the credentials had already been confirmed through the federal liaison? Ethan hesitated before admitting that he had been waiting for final confirmation and believed it had not yet arrived. Mercer slowly shook his head. He explained that the confirmation had been transmitted several minutes earlier and that the communication center had documented the successful verification. Ethan felt the confidence he had carried throughout the encounter begin to disappear. For the first time that evening, he looked at Naomi not as someone he suspected but as someone who had remained remarkably patient despite an increasingly complicated situation. Mercer then walked toward Naomi with measured respect. He introduced himself, thanked her for her patience, and apologized for the extended delay. Naomi acknowledged his words with a polite nod. She did not interrupt him, nor did she attempt to embarrass the young officer standing only a few feet away. Instead, she quietly asked a single question that seemed almost gentle in its simplicity. She asked whether the department would be preserving all available recordings from the encounter, including the dashboard camera, the radio traffic, and any related communications. Mercer answered immediately that every recording would be preserved according to department policy. Naomi thanked him and replied that transparency protected everyone, including officers who acted in good faith and citizens who deserved fair treatment. Her voice remained calm, carrying neither anger nor satisfaction. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment as those words settled into the evening air. He suddenly understood that the conversation had never been about winning an argument. It had always been about following the facts wherever they led. The interstate continued humming with passing traffic while darkness slowly settled across the Virginia landscape. A cool breeze moved through the trees beyond the shoulder, and the constant glow of headlights reflected across the polished surface of the black sedan. Dispatch transmitted one final update confirming that federal judicial security personnel had been notified that Judge Naomi Carter was safe. Mercer acknowledged the message and assured Naomi that she was free to continue her trip whenever she felt ready. Before returning her identification, he looked briefly toward Ethan and understood that the lesson unfolding beside that highway would remain with the rookie far longer than anything taught inside a classroom. Yet neither officer realized that the recordings they had promised to preserve would soon leave the evidence room, enter a courtroom, and ultimately become the foundation of a case that would force an entire department to examine not only one traffic stop, but the decisions made after certainty had already arrived. Naomi thanked Sergeant Mercer with quiet sincerity, accepted her identification, and returned to her vehicle without another word. She did not look back as she merged carefully into the evening traffic, her taillights gradually disappearing beyond the curve of the interstate. For Ethan, however, the encounter had only just begun. The silence that settled over the shoulder of the highway felt heavier than the rush of passing traffic. Mercer stood beside the rookie for several long moments before speaking. He did not raise his voice. He did not lecture him in anger. Instead, he asked Ethan to think carefully about one question. At what point had the facts stopped supporting his suspicion? Ethan searched his memory. He replayed every answer Naomi had given, every document she had presented, every confirmation dispatch had transmitted. The uncomfortable truth slowly emerged. The evidence had begun clearing her long before he allowed himself to believe it. Mercer explained that good policing required more than caution. It required the willingness to change direction the moment reliable facts replaced assumptions. Holding on to a conclusion after the evidence changed could damage public trust just as surely as ignoring evidence altogether. Ethan listened quietly, realizing that the lesson carried far greater weight because it had unfolded in the real world instead of a classroom. Back at headquarters later that evening, the communications log, radio recordings, dashboard camera footage, and dispatch records were automatically secured under department evidence procedures because the incident involved a member of the federal judiciary. Internal Affairs was notified according to policy, not because anyone had reached a conclusion, but because transparency demanded that every significant interaction involving verified concerns receive an independent review. The dashboard camera revealed something no memory ever could. It showed the exact timeline. It captured every pause, every question, every confirmation from dispatch, and every additional decision made after those confirmations arrived. Unlike human recollection, the recording neither favored nor criticized anyone. It simply preserved the truth exactly as it happened. Over the next several days, attorneys representing Judge Naomi Carter formally requested copies of every available record connected to the stop. They did not rely on emotion. They relied on timestamps, radio traffic, written reports, and recorded video. Each document fit together like pieces of a puzzle until the entire sequence became impossible to misunderstand. Investigators noticed that the original purpose of the traffic stop had gradually shifted into something much longer even after official verification had answered the central questions. That timeline would soon become one of the most closely examined aspects of the entire case. Ethan found himself replaying the encounter repeatedly after each shift ended. The more he remembered Naomi's calm responses, the more he recognized that she had never tried to challenge his authority. She had simply expected him to follow the same principle she applied every day inside her courtroom. Let facts lead the decision. Nothing else. Weeks later, when news organizations began reporting that legal action had been filed, public attention focused not on dramatic confrontation but on the quiet power of objective evidence. People watched the dashboard recording and reached their own conclusions by observing ordinary conversations, measured voices, and a sequence of decisions unfolding minute by minute. The most striking part of the recording was not what anyone shouted, because no one did. It was the unmistakable moment when verified facts became available, yet the course of the encounter continued in another direction. That single turning point would become the center of every legal argument that followed. The lawsuit moved forward with a pace that surprised almost everyone involved. What had begun as an ordinary traffic stop on a quiet Virginia interstate gradually became a case studied by attorneys, legal scholars, and law enforcement trainers across the country. Every filing relied on the same foundation. There were no dramatic eyewitness disputes and no conflicting versions of events. The dashboard camera, radio communications, dispatch records, and written reports all aligned with remarkable precision. Together they formed a timeline that neither side could rewrite. During depositions, department supervisors, communications personnel, and policy experts carefully explained each stage of the encounter. Attorneys repeatedly returned to one central question. Once the driver's identity and federal credentials had been verified through official channels, what objective reason remained for continuing the detention? It was a question that echoed through conference rooms, legal briefs, and courtroom arguments. The answer never became simpler with time. Judge Naomi Carter approached the proceedings with the same professionalism that had defined her conduct beside the highway. She never described herself as being above the law. Quite the opposite. She explained that every public official, including judges, officers, and elected leaders, should expect the law to apply equally. Her concern was never about personal status. It was about whether verified facts had been allowed to guide official decisions once those facts became available. That distinction resonated with many observers following the case. Ethan Brooks also testified. Months had passed since the stop, and the confidence that once drove every decision had been replaced by quiet reflection. He acknowledged that he had entered law enforcement wanting to protect his community, but he also admitted that experience had taught him a difficult lesson. Good intentions alone could never replace disciplined judgment. Policies existed for a reason, and evidence deserved greater authority than instinct. His testimony carried an honesty that many had not expected, but it could not change the documented sequence preserved by the recordings. Outside the courthouse, news organizations analyzed the dashboard footage frame by frame. Former judges, retired police chiefs, constitutional law professors, and training experts discussed not only the specific encounter but the broader importance of procedural fairness. Many pointed out that public confidence depended upon consistent application of standards regardless of a person's profession, appearance, or position. The recordings became educational material inside several training programs because they demonstrated how quickly a routine encounter could become legally significant after verified information entered the picture. Eventually, both parties reached a civil settlement valued at $2.8 million. The agreement resolved the legal claims without requiring a lengthy trial, but it did not erase the questions raised by the incident. The department announced additional training emphasizing investigative objectivity, communication with dispatch, and continuous reassessment whenever new evidence emerged during citizen encounters. Ethan remained quietly seated in the back of the briefing room when those policy updates were introduced. He recognized every example because he had lived through each one. Across the room, the dashboard recording played silently once again. There were no raised voices. There was no dramatic confrontation. Only ordinary decisions unfolding minute by minute until they produced extraordinary consequences. In that silence, everyone present understood the same truth. Justice is rarely changed by one dramatic moment. More often, it changes through a series of small choices made after the facts have already shown the way. Months after the settlement was finalized, the interstate where everything had begun looked exactly the same. Thousands of vehicles traveled that stretch of highway every day, most drivers unaware that one routine traffic stop had quietly influenced conversations about fairness, accountability, and professional judgment across the country. The road had not changed. The patrol vehicles had not changed. The laws had not changed. What changed were the people who understood how easily assumptions could continue long after the facts had already spoken. Judge Naomi Carter returned to the federal courthouse with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout her career. Colleagues occasionally asked about the lawsuit, but she rarely focused on the financial settlement. Instead, she spoke about something far more valuable. She reminded younger attorneys that institutions earned public trust only when they demonstrated the courage to examine their own mistakes honestly. Accountability, she often said, was not a sign of weakness. It was the strongest evidence that the rule of law remained alive. Officer Ethan Brooks continued serving his department under closer supervision while completing additional professional training. The experience stayed with him every time he activated his emergency lights behind another vehicle. He still approached every stop with caution, but caution no longer meant holding onto a suspicion after verified evidence had removed it. It meant slowing down, listening carefully, reassessing every new fact, and remembering that every person deserved the same objective treatment regardless of appearance, profession, or circumstance. Sergeant Daniel Mercer occasionally used the incident during training sessions for new recruits. He never mentioned it to embarrass anyone. Instead, he asked a simple question that usually filled the classroom with thoughtful silence. At what exact moment should an officer be willing to change course when new evidence arrives? The discussion that followed often lasted longer than the lesson itself because the answer mattered far beyond one highway in Virginia. It mattered every time authority met responsibility. It mattered every time a decision affected another person's dignity. Long after the headlines faded, the dashboard recording remained one of the most important witnesses. It had never formed an opinion. It had never shown anger, sympathy, or bias. It simply recorded the truth exactly as it unfolded, reminding everyone that facts possess a quiet strength that emotions cannot replace. Attorneys studied it. Trainers reviewed it. Students discussed it. Citizens watched it. Each person reached conclusions by observing the same uninterrupted sequence of ordinary decisions leading to extraordinary consequences. Imagine standing beside that highway knowing that every choice you make could someday be replayed in a courtroom, a classroom, or before millions of people searching not for perfection, but for fairness. That possibility belongs to every public servant entrusted with authority. It also belongs to every citizen who places faith in the promise that justice should never depend upon appearances or assumptions. In the end, this story was never truly about one officer or one judge. It was about the enduring principle that evidence must always speak louder than expectation, that respect should never depend upon identity, and that the law fulfills its highest purpose only when it protects every person with equal care. A badge may represent authority, a robe may represent justice, and a camera may preserve the truth, but character is revealed in the moment when facts challenge belief and someone chooses to follow the truth anyway. That is where public trust begins. That is where lasting justice is found.